The security camera's red light blinked steadily in the corner of the Millbrook Police Station waiting room, its unblinking electronic eye capturing every moment of what would become the most damning piece of evidence in the city's recent history. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the vinyl chairs and scuffed linoleum floor. In 12 minutes, that camera would record an act of violence so shocking, so utterly senseless, that it would shake the very foundations of the small Georgia town. Elijah Washington sat quietly beside his mother, his long legs folded awkwardly in the uncomfortable plastic chair. At 17, he had already reached 6 feet tall, his frame still growing into the height that made him seem older than his years. His mother, Dr. Sarah Washington, clutched a manila folder containing the police report forms they'd filled out about his stolen bicycle. The bike had been a gift for his acceptance into Georgia Tech's engineering program, a symbol of his bright future that had been snatched away in broad daylight from their own driveway. "This shouldn't take much longer, baby," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying the exhaustion of a woman who had spent the last 14 hours in surgery at Millbrook General Hospital. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy bun. She had insisted on coming straight from the hospital when Elijah called about the theft, refusing to let him handle the police report alone. The station's front desk was unmanned, a small sign reading, "Officer will be with you shortly," perched beside a bell that had been rung multiple times without response. The waiting area smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale coffee, punctuated by the occasional crackle of police radios from the back offices. Through the reinforced glass partition, they could see officers moving about their business, some laughing at shared jokes, others hunched over paperwork. Elijah pulled out his phone to check the time. They'd been waiting for nearly an hour, and his mother's shift at the hospital had already been extended twice this week. He could see the fatigue in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged with each passing minute. He was about to suggest they reschedule when heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway behind the partition. Officer Michael Hoa emerged from the back offices, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. At 38, he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who had never quite adjusted to civilian life after his military service. His jaw was set in a permanent scowl, and his pale blue eyes surveyed the waiting room with the suspicion of someone who saw threats in every shadow. The nameplate on his chest read M. Show A in block letters, and his badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You hear about the bike?" Hoa's voice was clipped, professional, but there was an edge to it that made Sarah's maternal instincts flare. She stood up, straightening her scrubs and extending her hand. "Yes, officer. I'm Dr. Sarah Washington, and this is my son Elijah. We filed a report earlier today about his stolen bicycle." Hoa ignored her outstretched hand, his gaze fixed on Elijah, who had also risen from his chair. The teenager stood with his hands at his sides, his posture respectful but confident. Something in that confidence, that refusal to shrink under scrutiny, seemed to irritate the officer. "Elijah Washington," Hoa said, his voice flat. "You're the one who says his bike was stolen." "Yes, sir. It was taken from our driveway yesterday morning between 7 and 8 a.m. I have the serial number and photos if you need them." Hoa's eyes narrowed. In his 15 years on the force, he had developed what he called a sixth sense about people, though others might have called it something else entirely. He saw in Elijah's calm demeanor not respect, but defiance. He saw in the teenager's articulate speech not education, but what he perceived as an attempt to sound better than he was. Most damning of all, he saw in Elijah's presence in this police station not a victim seeking help, but a potential threat to be neutralized. "You expect me to believe someone just walked into your neighborhood and took your bike?" Hoa's voice rose slightly. "You sure you didn't sell it for drug money, and now you're trying to file a false report?" The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah's mouth fell open, her medical training having prepared her for many emergencies, but not for this particular brand of prejudice delivered with a badge and uniform. Elijah felt his cheeks burn with indignation, but he kept his voice steady. "No, sir, I don't use drugs. The bike was stolen from our driveway on Maple Street. We have a security camera that shows someone taking it. Don't get smart with me, boy," Hoa snapped, taking a step closer. "I've heard that story 100 times. You probably sold it to one of your friends, and now you want the insurance money." Sarah stepped protectively in front of her son, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when dealing with difficult patients or incompetent residents. "Officer Hoa, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're here to report a theft, not to be accused of insurance fraud. My son is a straight-A student who's been accepted to Georgia Tech. We have evidence of the theft, and we simply want to file a proper report." But Hoa wasn't listening to her words. He was seeing what he wanted to see: a black teenager who didn't show the proper deference, who stood too tall, who spoke too clearly, who somehow thought he was better than his place in Hoa's worldview. The officer's hand moved unconsciously toward his duty belt, where his taser sat alongside his radio and handcuffs. "Ma'am, please step aside. I need to speak with your son about his attitude problem." "His attitude problem?" Sarah's voice rose to match Hoa's. "Officer, my son has been nothing but polite and respectful. We've been waiting here for over an hour, and now you're treating us like criminals instead of crime victims." Elijah placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder, trying to de-escalate the situation. He had learned about these moments in school, had heard the stories from friends and family, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The fluorescent light seemed brighter, the room smaller, the air thicker with tension. "Mom, it's okay." "Officer Hoa, I apologize if I seem disrespectful. That wasn't my intention. I just want to report the theft and go home." But Hoa interpreted even this attempt at peace as disrespect. In his mind, the teenager was trying to manage the situation, trying to control the narrative, trying to make the officer look bad in front of his mother. The veteran officer's jaw clenched, and his hand moved closer to his taser. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" Hoa's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a threat. "Standing there, acting like you're better than everyone else. I've seen your type before." The security camera continued its silent recording, capturing every word, every gesture, every moment of escalation. In the back offices, other officers were beginning to notice the raised voices, but none had yet emerged to intervene. The waiting room, which had seemed merely unwelcoming before, now felt like a cage. "Officer, I think we should just file the report and leave," Sarah said, her medical training kicking in as she recognized the signs of a situation spiraling out of control. "We don't want any trouble." "Too late for that," Hoa said, his hand now resting on his taser. "Your son here has been hostile since the moment I walked in. Hostile and uncooperative." Elijah felt the walls closing in around him. He thought of his acceptance letter to Georgia Tech, of his plans to study engineering, of his future that suddenly seemed so fragile. He thought of his father, who had died when he was 12, and how his mother had worked double shifts for years to give him opportunities. He thought of how proud his father would have been to see him heading to college, and how disappointed he would be to see him in this moment. "Sir, I haven't been hostile. I have answered your questions politely. I just want to file a report about my stolen bike." "That's it," Hoa said, his voice rising to a shout. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and being hostile to a police officer." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah gasped, stepping between her son and the officer. "You can't arrest him. He hasn't done anything wrong." But HOA was already moving, his taser drawn and pointed at Elijah. The teenager raised his hands instinctively, his body responding to the threat, even as his mind struggled to process what was happening. The waiting room, which had been merely uncomfortable before, now felt like a battlefield. "Get your hands behind your back!" HOA screamed, his voice echoing off the walls. "Now!" "I'm not resisting!" Elijah shouted back, his voice cracking with fear and confusion. "I'm complying." But in HOA's mind, the teenager's raised hands were a sign of defiance, not compliance. The officer's finger tightened on the taser's trigger, and in that moment, years of prejudice, paranoia, and poorly managed authority converged into a single, devastating action. The taser's electrical discharge lit up the waiting room like a lightning strike. 50,000 volts of electricity coursed through Elijah's body, dropping him to the floor in convulsions. His mother's scream pierced the air, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The smell of ozone filled the room, mixed with the acrid scent of fear and the metallic taste of injustice. Elijah. Sarah dropped to her knees beside her son, her medical training taking over even as her heart shattered. She checked his pulse, his breathing, her hands shaking as she examined him for injuries. "Baby, can you hear me?" The teenager's body jerked and twitched as the electrical current dissipated, his muscles spasming involuntarily. His eyes were wide with shock and pain, and for a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but lie on the cold linoleum floor and wonder how filing a police report had led to this. "Stay down!" HOA shouted, his taser still trained on the writhing teenager. "Don't move, or I'll tase you again." "He's not moving!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. "He's a child! How could you do this to a child?" The commotion had finally drawn other officers from the back offices. Sergeant Maria Lopez was the first to arrive, her experienced eyes taking in the scene with growing horror. Behind her came Officer James Chen and Rookie Officer Ashley Brooks, their faces reflecting the same shock and disbelief. "HOA! What the hell happened here?" Lopez demanded, her voice carrying the authority of her 20 years on the force. "Suspect was being hostile and uncooperative," HOA replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "He was making threatening gestures, so I had to subdue him." Lopez looked at the teenager on the floor, at his mother kneeling beside him, at the manila folder scattered with police report forms. Her eyes moved to the security camera in the corner, its red light still blinking steadily. Whatever had happened here, it was all on tape. "Chen, call for an ambulance," Lopez ordered. "Brooks, help me get this kid checked out. And HOA, holster your weapon and step back." "He's still dangerous," HOA protested. But Lopez cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. "He's a 17-year-old kid who came in to report a stolen bike. Step back. Now." Sarah continued to tend to her son, her medical knowledge warring with her maternal instincts. Elijah's breathing was returning to normal, but she could see the trauma in his eyes, the way he flinched when any of the officers moved too quickly. She had treated taser victims in the emergency room before, but seeing her own child writhing on the floor had been a different kind of hell entirely. "Mom," Elijah whispered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know, baby. I know." Tears streamed down her face as she stroked his hair. "We're going to get through this." Officer Chen returned with the news that paramedics were en route, and Lopez knelt beside the teenager to assess his condition. Her 20 years of experience had taught her to read situations quickly, and everything about this scene was wrong. The scattered police report forms, the mother's scrubs indicating she was a medical professional, the complete absence of any weapon or contraband. None of it added up to Hoa's story. "Son, can you tell me what happened?" Lopez asked gently. "We came to report my stolen bike," Elijah said, struggling to sit up. "Officer Hoa started accusing me of selling it for drugs, and when I tried to explain, he said I was being hostile." "That's not what happened," Hoa interjected, but Lopez silenced him with a raised hand. "Dr. Washington." "Is it?" Lopez asked, noting the name embroidered on Sarah's scrubs. "Can you tell me what you saw?" Sarah's voice shook as she recounted the events, her medical training helping her to be precise and factual, even in her emotional state. She described the accusations, the escalation, the moment when Hoa had drawn his taser without provocation. Lopez listened carefully, her expression growing darker with each detail. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional demeanor shifting to concern when they saw the teenager on the floor. They checked his vital signs, asked about his medical history, and began the standard protocol for taser victims. As they worked, more officers began to gather in the waiting room, drawn by the unusual activity. "Sarge, we should probably review the security footage," Officer Chen suggested quietly. "Already on it," Lopez replied, her eyes fixed on the camera in the corner. "Brooks, I want you to secure that footage right now. Nobody touches it until Internal Affairs gets here." As the paramedics finished their examination and determined that Elijah didn't need to be transported to the hospital, the teenager slowly got to his feet with his mother's help. He was shaky but mobile, and, more importantly, he was angry. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a burning sense of injustice that made his eyes flash with determination. "I want to file a complaint," he said, his voice stronger now. "This is wrong. This is so wrong." "You'll have every opportunity to do that," Lopez assured him. "But first, I need to understand exactly what happened here." Hoa watched the proceedings with growing unease. His version of events was becoming increasingly isolated as other officers began to question his account. The security camera loomed over the scene like a digital judge, its memory containing the truth that would either vindicate or damn him. "I need to call my husband," Sarah said, pulling out her phone with trembling hands. "He's going to want to know what happened." "Of course," Lopez replied. "Take all the time you need." As Sarah dialed her husband's number, she realized that this moment would divide their family's life into before and after. Before, when they lived in a world where police officers were supposed to protect and serve. After, when they would forever be reminded that their son's skin color made him a target, even in a police station while seeking help. "David, you need to come to the police station right now," she said into the phone, her voice barely controlled. "They tased Elijah." The voice on the other end of the line rose in volume, and Sarah had to hold the phone away from her ear. She could hear her husband's shock and anger even from several feet away, and she knew that he was already reaching for his keys, already calculating the fastest route to the station. "Just get here," she said. "We'll explain everything when you arrive." What Sarah didn't know, what none of them knew in that moment, was that David Washington was not just Elijah's stepfather. He was not just a concerned parent rushing to protect his child. He was the mayor of Millbrook, Georgia, and his arrival at the police station was about to transform a case of police brutality into a political earthquake that would reshape the entire city. The waiting room had become a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape, while Officer Brooks secured the security footage. Other officers milled about, their conversations hushed but urgent. Word was spreading through the station that something significant had happened, something that would likely make headlines and trigger investigations. Elijah sat in a different chair now, his mother beside him, both of them waiting for David to arrive. The teenager kept flexing his fingers, testing his motor functions, trying to shake off the lingering effects of the electrical shock. The smell of ozone still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the violence that had occurred. "This is insane," he muttered, shaking his head. "I came here to report a stolen bike, and I ended up getting tased." "Don't talk about it too much right now," Sarah advised, her medical training teaching her to be cautious about potential legal implications. "Wait until Dad gets here." Sergeant Lopez was reviewing the incident report that HOA had hastily filed, her experienced eyes catching inconsistencies and red flags. The officer's account described a hostile suspect making threatening gestures, but the physical evidence didn't support that narrative. There were no weapons, no drugs, no signs of resistance or struggle beyond the aftermath of the tasing itself. "HOA, I need you to walk me through this again," Lopez said, her voice carefully neutral. "From the beginning. Like I said, the suspect was being hostile and uncooperative. He was making threatening gestures, so I had to subdue him for officer safety." "What kind of threatening gestures?" HOA hesitated, realizing that his story was beginning to unravel under scrutiny. "He was standing in an aggressive posture, refusing to comply with my commands." "What commands did you give him?" "I told him to put his hands behind his back, and he raised them up instead." "You told him to put his hands behind his back before you arrested him?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Lopez's years of experience had taught her to ask the right questions, to find the holes in fabricated stories, to distinguish between justified use of force and abuse of power. HOA's account was falling apart under even basic scrutiny. I told him he was under arrest for disorderly conduct, and then I gave him the command." "And what was he doing that constituted disorderly conduct?" Before HOA could answer, the station's front door burst open, and David Washington strode in with the purposeful gait of a man accustomed to command. At 52, he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had spent years in public service. His silver hair and well-tailored suit marking him as a person of importance. But in that moment, he was simply a father whose child had been hurt. "Where is he?" David's voice carried across the waiting room as he took in the scene. "Where's my son?" "Dad." Elijah stood up, relief flooding his face as he saw his stepfather. David had been part of their family for 8 years, and to Elijah, he was simply Dad. David crossed the room in quick strides, pulling Elijah into a fierce hug before examining him for injuries. His political instincts were screaming that this was a crisis of enormous proportions, but his paternal instincts were stronger. His son had been hurt, and everything else was secondary. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" David's hands moved over Elijah's arms and shoulders, checking for damage. "I'm okay, Dad, but they tased me. They tased me for trying to report a stolen bike." David's jaw tightened, and his politician's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the raw anger beneath. He had spent years building relationships with the police department, working to improve community relations, advocating for better training and accountability. Now, seeing his son as a victim of the very system he had tried to reform, he felt those efforts crumbling around him. "Which officer?" David's voice was dangerously quiet. "That one." Elijah pointed to HOA, who was still standing near the partition, his face pale as he began to recognize the man who had just entered. David turned to look at Officer HOA, and in that moment, the full weight of the situation hit the police officer like a physical blow. He had seen David Washington on television, had watched him speak at city council meetings, had even attended a few community policing events where the mayor had emphasized the importance of building trust between law enforcement and the community. Now, that same mayor was staring at him with the cold fury of a father whose child had been wronged. "You're Mayor Washington," Hoa said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am. And you just tased my son." The words fell like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of shock through the assembled officers. Sergeant Lopez felt her stomach drop as she realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. This wasn't just a case of excessive force. It was a political catastrophe that would echo through every level of city government. "Sir, I didn't know," Hoa stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "I was just doing my job." "Your job is to protect and serve the community," David replied, his voice steady, but filled with barely contained rage. "Not to assault teenagers who come here seeking help." The station had fallen silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chatter of police radios. Other officers watched the confrontation with a mixture of horror and fascination, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would define their department's future. "Mayor Washington, I'm Sergeant Lopez." Maria stepped forward, her years of experience teaching her to take control of deteriorating situations. "I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously. We've secured the security footage, and we're beginning a full investigation." "Good," David replied, his political instincts beginning to engage alongside his paternal ones. "Because I want answers. I want to know how my son came to file a police report and ended up being tased in your waiting room." As David spoke, his phone began to buzz with incoming calls. Word was already spreading through the city's political networks, and reporters were beginning to catch wind of the story. The mayor's son had been tased at the police station. It was the kind of headline that would dominate news cycles and trigger federal investigations. "I need to speak with Chief Morrison," David said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of political leadership. "Right now." "He's not in tonight, sir. But I can call him." "Call him. Tell him the mayor needs to speak with him immediately about a use of force incident involving his son." As Lopez moved to make the call, David pulled out his own phone and began dialing. His first call was to the city attorney, his second to the chairman of the city council, his third to the NAACP president. Each conversation was brief and urgent, setting in motion the machinery of accountability that would soon descend upon the Millbrook Police Department. Officer Hoa watched these proceedings with growing dread. His 15 years of experience had taught him to recognize when a situation was spiraling beyond control. And this was clearly one of those moments. The teenager he had tased wasn't just any teenager. He was the mayor's son. And that changed everything. "This is all a misunderstanding," Hoa said, his voice rising with desperation. "The kid was being hostile, and I had to act to protect myself and others." "Hostile?" David's voice was incredulous. "He came here with his mother to report a stolen bicycle. How exactly was he being hostile?" "He was making threatening gestures, refusing to comply with my commands." "What commands? You weren't arresting him for anything. He was a victim reporting a crime." The logic was irrefutable, and Hoa found himself backed into a corner with no good options. His story was falling apart under scrutiny, and the security camera footage would either vindicate him or destroy him. Based on what he knew had actually happened, he was increasingly certain it would be the latter. Chief Morrison arrived within 30 minutes, his face grim as he took in the scene. He had been awakened by Lopez's call, and the drive to the station had given him time to understand the magnitude of the crisis facing his department. The mayor's son had been tased, and there was video evidence. Nothing about this situation was salvageable. "David, I came as soon as I got the call," Morrison said, his voice heavy with the weight of their long professional relationship. "How is Elijah?" "He's been better, Tom. Your officer decided to use a taser on him while he was trying to report a stolen bike." Morrison looked at Officer Hoa, who was standing apart from the other officers like a pariah. The chief had been worried about Hoa for months, had received complaints about his aggressive tactics and poor community relations. Now, those chickens were coming home to roost in the worst possible way. "I need to see the footage," Morrison said. "It's already secured," Lopez replied. "I can have it pulled up in the conference room." "Do it. And I want internal affairs here within the hour." As the official machinery of investigation began to move, David made a decision that would transform this from a local incident into a national story. He pulled out his phone and began recording a video message that would be posted to his official social media accounts within minutes. "Tonight, my son Elijah was tased by a Millbrook police officer while trying to report a stolen bicycle. He was unarmed, cooperative, and seeking help from the very people sworn to protect and serve our community. This is not just a failure of one officer. It's a failure of systems that allow such abuse to occur. I promise you, there will be accountability. There will be justice. And there will be change." The video was posted before Chief Morrison could object, and within minutes, it was being shared across social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story, and reporters began making calls to the police department and City Hall. The incident that had begun in a quiet waiting room was now becoming a national conversation about police brutality and racial justice. As the night wore on, the police station became a hub of activity. Internal affairs investigators arrived, followed by FBI agents who were monitoring the federal implications of the case. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras and microphones ready to capture any new developments. The small-town police station had become the center of a storm that would reshape the entire community. In the conference room, Chief Morrison, Sergeant Lopez, and the internal affairs team reviewed the security footage frame by frame. The video was damning, showing clearly that Elijah had been cooperative throughout the encounter, that he had raised his hands in compliance rather than resistance, and that Officer HOA had escalated the situation without justification. "This is indefensible," Morrison said, his voice filled with disgust. "Absolutely indefensible." "Sir, what do you want us to do about HOA?" Lopez asked. "Suspend him immediately. Full investigation, and I want the DA's office to review this for criminal charges." Meanwhile, in the waiting room, Elijah sat with his parents, still processing what had happened to him. The physical effects of the tasing had worn off, but the emotional trauma was just beginning. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, trying to understand what he could have done differently, what he could have said to prevent Officer HOA from seeing him as a threat. "This isn't your fault," Sarah said, reading her son's thoughts. "You did nothing wrong." "I know, Mom. But I keep thinking about it. What if I had been more deferential? What if I had spoken differently?" "No!" David's voice was firm. "You don't change who you are because of other people's prejudices. You were respectful. You were cooperative. And you were seeking help. That officer failed. Not you." The conversation was interrupted by Chief Morrison's return, his face grave as he approached the family. Behind him walked a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Captain Jennifer Hayes from Internal Affairs. "Mayor Washington, I want to personally apologize for what happened here tonight," Morrison said. "Officer HOA has been suspended pending a full investigation, and we're cooperating fully with the district attorney's office." "That's a start," David replied. "But this goes beyond one officer. This is about a culture that allows such incidents to occur." "I agree. And I want to work with you to address those systemic issues." As the officials talked, Elijah found himself thinking about his future. He was supposed to start at Georgia Tech in the fall, supposed to study engineering and build a life for himself. Now, he was the center of a national conversation about police brutality, a symbol of injustice that he had never wanted to become. "I want to speak at the city council meeting," Elijah said suddenly, interrupting the adult conversation. "I want to tell people what happened." "Son, you don't have to do that," David said gently. "You've been through enough." "I know. But if I don't speak up, nothing will change. Other kids will go through what I went through." The determination in his voice reminded David of himself at that age, of the fire that had driven him into public service. His son had been victimized, but he was refusing to be defined by that victimization. Instead, he was choosing to use his voice to create change. "Then you'll speak," David said, "and the whole city will listen." The Millbrook City Council chambers had never seen a crowd like this. Every seat was filled, with additional people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The regular monthly meeting had been transformed into an emergency session, called specifically to address the incident at the police station. Local media filled the front rows, their cameras focused on the podium where Elijah would soon stand. News of the incident had spread far beyond Millbrook's borders. National civil rights organizations had sent representatives, and protesters had gathered outside City Hall with signs demanding justice. The small Georgia town had become a focal point for conversations about police reform and racial equality that were happening across the country. Elijah sat in the front row between his parents, his hands folded in his lap as he reviewed the speech he had written. The words felt inadequate to describe what he had experienced, but they were all he had. He had spent hours crafting each sentence, trying to find a way to turn his trauma into something constructive, something that might prevent other families from experiencing what his had endured. City Council Chairman Robert Chen called the meeting to order, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. The chamber fell silent as he explained the purpose of the emergency session and outlined the procedures for public comment. It was clear that this was not a typical council meeting, but rather a moment of reckoning for the entire community. Before we begin with public comments, I want to acknowledge the gravity of what has brought us here tonight. We are gathered because a young man in our community was subjected to excessive force while seeking help from our police department. This is not just a failure of one officer. It's a failure of systems that we as a community must address. The chamber remained silent as Chen continued, his words carrying the weight of institutional acknowledgement. Around the room, faces reflected a mixture of anger, sadness, and determination. This was a community grappling with the reality that their faith in local law enforcement had been shattered by a single incident of brutality. Our first speaker tonight is Elijah Washington, who will share his account of what happened at the police station 3 days ago. Elijah rose from his seat, his legs suddenly feeling unsteady as he approached the podium. The walk seemed to take forever, each step echoing in the silent chamber. He could feel hundreds of eyes upon him, could see the camera lenses focused on his face, could sense the weight of expectation that surrounded him. At the podium, he looked out over the crowd and saw faces he recognized, teachers from his high school, neighbors from his street, classmates who had come to support him. But he also saw strangers, people who had come from other cities to witness this moment of accountability. The diversity of the crowd reminded him that his story had resonated far beyond his own experience. "My name is Elijah Washington, and I'm 17 years old. 3 days ago, I went to the police station with my mother to report that my bicycle had been stolen. I never expected that reporting a crime would turn me into a victim of one." His voice was steady, but those who knew him best could detect the tremor beneath his words. The chamber remained absolutely silent, every person hanging on his testimony. This was not just a teenager speaking. This was a survivor bearing witness to injustice. "Officer HOA accused me of selling my bike for drug money before I even had a chance to explain what happened. When I tried to remain respectful and answer his questions, He became more aggressive. He saw my politeness as disrespect, my compliance as defiance, my very presence as a threat. The raw honesty of his words cut through the chamber like a blade. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, confronting the reality of how bias had shaped an officer's perception of a teenage victim. This was not just about one incident. It was about the broader patterns of prejudice that infected interactions between police and communities of color. I raised my hands when he drew his taser. I told him I was complying. But it didn't matter. In his mind, I was already guilty of something. The color of my skin, the way I spoke, the fact that I stood up straight instead of cowering, all of it was evidence of my guilt. In the audience, Sarah Washington wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to her son describe the trauma he had endured. Beside her, David maintained his composure, but his hands were clenched into fists. They were proud of Elijah's courage in speaking out, but they were also reliving their own trauma from that night. When 50,000 volts of electricity coursed through my body, I wasn't just experiencing physical pain. I was experiencing the pain of realizing that, in this country, seeking help can be dangerous if you look like me. I was experiencing the pain of understanding that my future could be stolen from me by someone who saw me as a threat instead of a human being. The chamber remained silent, but the emotional weight of his words was palpable. People dabbed at their eyes with tissues. Others nodded in recognition, and still others sat in stunned silence as they processed the implications of what he was describing. But I'm not here tonight just to describe what happened to me. I'm here to demand that we do better. I'm here to insist that no other teenager should have to experience what I experienced. I'm here to say that our community is better than this, and we need to prove it. His voice grew stronger as he moved from testimony to advocacy, from victim to activist. The transformation was remarkable to witness, and it spoke to the resilience of someone who refused to be defined by trauma. I want Officer HOA to be held accountable for his actions. I want the police department to implement new training programs that address implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. I want a civilian review board to provide oversight of police conduct. And I want our community to have honest conversations about race and justice that go beyond this single incident. As he spoke these words, Elijah felt a sense of power that he had never experienced before. He was no longer just a victim. He was an agent of change, someone who could use his voice to create a better future for his community. The trauma he had endured was becoming a catalyst for transformation. I'm supposed to start college in the fall. I'm supposed to study engineering and build a life for myself. But I've learned that I also have a responsibility to build a better community for all of us. What happened to me was wrong, but it will only be meaningless if we don't use it to create change. The chamber erupted in applause as Elijah finished his remarks, the sound filling the room like thunder. People rose to their feet, some wiping away tears, others shouting their support. The teenager had done more than just describe his trauma. He had articulated a vision for justice that resonated with everyone present. As the applause continued, Elijah looked out over the crowd and saw something that gave him hope. He saw black faces and white faces, young people and elderly citizens, police officers and activists, all united in their commitment to making things better. His story had become a bridge connecting people across racial and ideological divides. When the applause finally died down, Chairman Chen called for additional speakers. One by one, community members approached the podium to share their own experiences with police, their thoughts on reform, and their support for Elijah's courage in speaking out. The testimony continued for over 2 hours, creating a comprehensive record of community sentiment. Chief Morrison was among the speakers, his face grave as he addressed the crowd. His appearance had been controversial. Some community members felt he was part of the problem, while others believed he was committed to reform. His words would be crucial in determining the department's path forward. "I have served this community for 23 years, and I have never been more ashamed of the actions of one of my officers. What happened to Elijah Washington was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for the culture that allowed it to occur." The chief's admission of responsibility was significant, representing a departure from the typical defensive posture of law enforcement agencies facing criticism. His words suggested that real change might be possible, that the department was prepared to confront its own shortcomings. "Officer HOA has been terminated from the department, and we are cooperating fully with the district attorney's office as they pursue criminal charges. But that's not enough. We need systemic change, and I'm committed to working with this community to implement it." Morrison outlined a comprehensive reform plan that included new training programs, body cameras for all officers, and the establishment of a civilian review board. It was an ambitious agenda, one that would require significant resources and political will to implement successfully. The final speaker of the evening was Mayor David Washington, who approached the podium with the weight of dual roles, as a political leader and as a father. His remarks would need to balance his official responsibilities with his personal experience of having his son victimized by his own police department. "3 days ago, I was a mayor who believed that our police department was making progress on community relations. Tonight, I'm a father who knows that progress means nothing if it doesn't protect our children." His voice carried the emotion of someone who had been personally affected by the failures of the system he was supposed to oversee. The audience listened intently as he described the phone call from his wife, the race to the police station, and the moment when he realized that his son had become a victim of police brutality. "But I'm also a public servant who believes that we can do better. The reforms that Chief Morrison has outlined are a good start, but they're only the beginning. We need to rebuild trust between our police and our community, and that will require ongoing commitment from all of us." David announced the formation of a Police Accountability Commission, with Elijah as its youngest member. The commission would have real power to investigate complaints, review policies, and recommend changes to police practices. It was a significant step toward the kind of civilian oversight that communities across the country were demanding. "My son has shown remarkable courage in speaking out about what happened to him. He has turned his trauma into a catalyst for change, and I'm proud of him for that. But I'm also angry that he had to experience such trauma in the first place. We failed him, and we failed this community. We will not fail again." As the meeting concluded, people began to file out of the chamber, but many lingered to speak with Elijah and his family. The teenager found himself surrounded by supporters, by people who wanted to thank him for his courage, by activists who wanted to work with him on reform efforts. Among those who approached him was Officer Jennifer Brooks, the rookie who had been present during the incident. She had been haunted by what she had witnessed, and she wanted to apologize for not intervening sooner. "I should have done more," she said, tears in her eyes. "I should have stepped in before it escalated." "You were there when it mattered," Elijah replied. "You helped secure the evidence, and you supported the investigation. That took courage too." The exchange was brief but significant, representing the kind of honest conversation between police and community that would be necessary for real healing to occur. Brooks would go on to become one of the department's most vocal advocates for reform, using her position to push for changes from within. As the Washington family finally left the city hall, they were greeted by a crowd of supporters who had gathered outside. The scene was peaceful but powerful, with people holding candles and signs calling for justice. It was a reminder that Elijah's story had resonated far beyond the council chambers. Local news crews, conducted interviews with community members, capturing the sense of hope and determination that had emerged from the evening's proceedings. The story would be broadcast across the state and picked up by national outlets, turning Millbrook's response to police brutality into a model for other communities. 6 months later, the changes in Millbrook were visible everywhere. Body cameras had been installed on every officer, and the footage was regularly reviewed by the new Civilian Oversight Board. The police department had implemented comprehensive bias training, and officers were required to complete de-escalation courses every quarter. Officer Michael HOA had been convicted of assault and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The trial had been swift and decisive, with the security footage providing irrefutable evidence of his guilt. He had become a symbol of the old way of policing, the kind of officer who saw communities of color as enemy territory rather than places to protect and serve. The police department's relationship with the community had been fundamentally transformed. Officers participated in community events, attended neighborhood meetings, and worked closely with local organizations to address problems before they escalated. The change wasn't just cosmetic, it was cultural, representing a shift from enforcement to partnership. Elijah had started college at Georgia Tech as planned, but he had also become a national advocate for police reform. He spoke at conferences, consulted with other communities, and worked with civil rights organizations to push for legislative changes. His voice had become a powerful force for justice, turning his trauma into a tool for transformation. The Police Accountability Commission had investigated dozens of complaints and recommended numerous policy changes. Their work had been thorough and transparent, building trust between the community and law enforcement. The commission had become a model for other cities, demonstrating that civilian oversight could be both effective and fair. On the anniversary of the incident, Elijah returned to the police station where he had been tased. But this time, he was there for a different reason. The department was holding a community open house, and he had been invited to speak about the changes that had occurred over the past year. The waiting room looked different now. The harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced with warmer fixtures, and the uncomfortable plastic chairs had been upgraded to more welcoming furniture. But most importantly, the atmosphere was different. Officers greeted visitors with smiles, and the partition between the waiting area and the offices had been removed. "It's hard to believe this is the same place," Elijah said as he stood at the podium in the station's community room. "A year ago, I was tased in that waiting room for trying to report a stolen bike. Today, I'm here to celebrate the changes that have transformed this department and this community." The audience included police officers, community members, and city officials, all gathered to commemorate the progress that had been made. Chief Morrison sat in the front row, his expression reflecting both pride in the changes and continued remorse for what had happened. "Change is possible," Elijah continued, "but it requires courage from all of us. It requires officers to acknowledge when their colleagues are wrong, community members to engage with law enforcement constructively, and leaders to prioritize justice over politics." As he spoke, Elijah thought about his father, who had died when he was 12. He wondered what his father would think of the man he had become, of the way he had used his voice to create change. He believed his father would be proud, not just of his academic achievements, but of his commitment to justice. "I still think about that night sometimes. I think about the fear I felt, the injustice of it all, the way my mother screamed when I was tased. But I also think about what came after. I think about the community that rallied around us, the officers who stood up for what was right, and the changes that proved we could do better." The speech was shorter than his remarks at the city council meeting, but it was no less powerful. He had learned to use his voice efficiently, to convey maximum impact with minimum words. The audience listened intently, understanding that they were hearing from someone who had transformed personal trauma into societal change. This is what justice looks like. Not revenge, but reform. Not punishment alone, but prevention. Not just accountability for the past, but hope for the future. As the event concluded, Elijah was approached by a young black teenager who reminded him of himself a year earlier. The boy was nervous, but determined, and he wanted to thank Elijah for his courage in speaking out. "I live in the next county over," the boy said. "Your story gave me hope that things could change here too." "They can change," Elijah replied, "but it takes work from all of us. Don't wait for someone else to make the first move. Use your voice, get involved, and never accept that injustice is just the way things are." The conversation reminded Elijah of why he had chosen to speak out in the first place. It wasn't just about his own experience. It was about creating a better future for the next generation. Every young person who felt safer because of the changes in Millbrook made his trauma worthwhile. As the Washington family drove home that evening, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The pain of that night at the police station would never fully fade, but it had been transformed into something constructive, something that had made their community stronger and more just. "I'm proud of you," David said to his son as they pulled into their driveway. "Not just for what you did tonight, but for who you've become." "I'm proud of all of us," Elijah replied. "We turned the worst night of our lives into the beginning of something better." The family walked into their house together, passing the spot where Elijah's bicycle had been stolen over a year earlier. The bike had been recovered weeks later, but it had become a symbol of something larger. The way that seeking justice for small crimes could reveal systemic problems that required comprehensive solutions. Inside their home, they found a package waiting for them. It was from a high school student in California who had organized a police reform campaign in her own community after hearing Elijah's story. The package contained thank you letters from dozens of students, each one describing how they had been inspired to take action in their own schools and communities. Reading through the letters, Elijah was struck by the ripple effect of his decision to speak out. His story had traveled across the country, inspiring other young people to demand better from their institutions and their communities. The trauma that had begun in a police station waiting room had become a movement for change. As he prepared for bed that night, Elijah looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at him was older than it had been a year ago, marked by experiences that had forced him to grow up faster than he should have. But it was also stronger, more confident, more purposeful. He thought about the security camera that had recorded his tasing, the electronic eye that had captured every moment of injustice. That camera had been intended to protect the police station, but it had ended up protecting him, providing the evidence that made accountability possible. Sometimes justice came from the most unexpected places. Tomorrow, he would return to Georgia Tech, where he was studying engineering and preparing for a career that would allow him to solve problems and build things. But he would also continue his work as an advocate, using his voice to push for reforms that would make other communities safer and more just. The stolen bicycle that had started it all was hanging in their garage, restored and ready to ride. But Elijah rarely used it anymore. He had learned that sometimes the most important journeys couldn't be taken on wheels, but required the courage to stand up, speak out, and demand that the world live up to its highest ideals. As he turned off the light and settled into bed, Elijah felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not for what had happened to him, but for what had happened because of him. He had learned that trauma could be transformed into purpose, that victims could become advocates, and that even the darkest moments could become the beginning of something brighter. The red light on the security camera had stopped blinking long ago, but its memory lived on in the changes that had swept through Millbrook. Justice had been served. Not just in the courtroom where Officer Hoa was convicted, but in the streets where police and community members now worked together as partners rather than adversaries. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the moment of violence that had brought them together, but the months of healing that had followed. Not the failure of one officer, but the success of an entire community in choosing justice over indifference, reform over resignation, hope over despair. The story that had begun with a teenager seeking help for a stolen bicycle had become something much larger, a testament to the power of courage, the importance of accountability, and the possibility of change. It was a story that would continue to inspire others long after the cameras stopped rolling and the reporters moved on to other stories. Because in the end, that was what justice looked like, not a single moment of retribution, but a lifetime of commitment to making things better. Not just for oneself, but for everyone who would come after. Not just for today, but for all the tomorrows that would follow. And as Elijah Washington drifted off to sleep, he knew that his story was far from over. It was just the beginning of a lifetime spent building a more just and equitable world. One conversation, one reform, one act of courage at a time. The security camera's red light had stopped blinking, but the light of justice would continue to shine, illuminating the path forward for generations to come.